Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Williams for that wonderful introduction. And also thanks to you, Cheryl, for keeping up with me and keeping on me so that everything goes fine today. Congratulations to Commissioner Clyburn and to you, Mr. Davis, for your phenomenal work. I feel as though, as a minister, I've been upstaged by your stories already. I'm thinking about the scripture that Commissioner Clyburn lifted up that says, God does not look at the outside, but looks at the heart. And I'm also holding with that the message of Mr. Davis that we have an incredible opportunity to do great things. The choice is ours. There's a West African proverb that states, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. There are not many similarities that I would draw between faith leaders, media, and movement work, but having lived through the 60s in Birmingham, Alabama, as a young Black girl, and then through the Ferguson Uprising as an older Black woman pastor, I am aware of the power and the marginalization of the lion's story. I am remembering in Ferguson when the uprising began, shortly after the killing of Michael Brown Jr., that a group of faith leaders, including myself, had to come together and decide how to move from being reactionary to actionary. Those conversations were difficult for us because we had not been given the time to decide collectively how we felt about what was happening in Ferguson. There were certainly some of us who wondered whether or not law enforcement's actions were justified. There were those of us who were wrestling with the very clear message that we had been disconnected from many of the young people in our communities, and therefore had lost the moral authority, in their opinion, to come out and lead anything. There were others of us who were sick and tired of being sick and tired and had been following not just the killing of Michael Brown, but were acutely aware that Michael Brown's death represented the 189th killing in St. Louis that year alone. We found ourselves in a room trying to come up with what would be our place and our purpose in this moment. And we decided that we must be the keepers of the story. We decided, as we had been inundated with media from all over the world, that we must hold a line that made people accountable of not just telling what was happening in that particular moment, but framing that moment contextually, so that a clear picture of what was really happening in Ferguson came through. This is a foundational lesson for those of us who attend seminary. Context matters. Context matters in pulpits, where the extrapolation of meaning from sacred text has been the catalyst for the oppression and marginalization of people in manners that are antithetical to the message of love and justice that undergirds most of our sacred texts, no matter the faith. Most of us have borne witness to the use of sacred texts, quoted verbatim, to ostracize, marginalize, and in some instances demonize the other. Demonize women, the LGBTQI community, non-white people, and those of differing faiths. Context matters in movement work. where the analysis of any particular response is located situationally rather than contextually. For instance, recently as the nation watched an uprising in Charlotte, North Carolina, following the killing of Keith Scott, a young unarmed Black man sitting in a car who, when approached by police, did not immediately respond in the manner law enforcement required, and who was shot multiple times and killed, in spite of pleas from his wife that Mr. Scott was unarmed and suffered from traumatic brain injury. I was called to go to Charlotte, called by clergy to meet with them and to help them discern what should be their method of action. I remember a reporter from the Charlotte Observer asking me why the community's response to the killing of Mr. Scott included destruction of some property. I quoted for her Dr. Martin Luther King's words, "Riot is the language of the unheard," and then offered some contextualization by reminding the reporter that Mr. Scott was not an isolated incident for the lions among us, but rather Mr. Scott was the 791st person killed by law enforcement this year, a number that now reaches 843. And while I make no assertions about the justification or lack thereof of these killings, I do add that Mr. Scott was the 4th unarmed Black man shot dead by police in a 10-day span of time in the US. Activists and protesters and angry residents of Charlotte began gathering for Keith Scott, yes, not because of the mainstream narrative of an isolated shooting, but rather from a contextual narrative that continues to present the unarmed killing of Black and brown bodies in America. Keith Scott, killed on 9/20 in Charlotte. Tawan Boyd, killed on 9/17 while in custody in Maryland. Terrence Crutcher, killed on 9/16 when his car broke down in Oklahoma. Tyree King, killed on 9/14 at the age of 13, shot in the back as he ran away from law enforcement in Columbus, Ohio. Terrence Sterling, killed on 9/11 when the police tried to stop him on his motorcycle and he tried to run by driving his motorcycle, hit a police car, and was killed in Washington, D.C. And 7 days after Mr. Scott, Alfred Alango was tasered and then shot dead while having a seizure in El Cajon, California. And that's before we consider the lives of people like Corinne Gaines, who was killed in her home while holding her child, refusing to open the door for the police, or Sandra Bland, who was found hanging in a jail cell in Waller, Texas, or Kim King, who was found hanging in a jail cell in St. Louis, Missouri. The list goes on and on. These situations, these stories are not new for the lion. But there is something new. We are now living in a generation where mainstream media is not the only resource for hearing the story. And access to alternative modes of storytelling, like live streaming, social media, activist reporting, is making it difficult for the narrative to remain how we want it to be told. Context matters in media. Reporters have a unique opportunity and a responsibility to not only capture the moment in print, in photos, in news stories, they have a moral responsibility to also capture the context. It is interesting how the hunter tells the story. It's different from the lion, And that difference is always located in context. On August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown Jr., an unarmed 18-year-old black male child, was killed by then Officer Darren Wilson. This was neither the first, as I said before, nor the last time an unarmed black male child has met his demise in this manner in Ferguson. And it certainly is not the first time it's happened in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, prior to his killing, there had already been several. And during the time when the media was covering his killing, there were at least 6 more. Michael Brown, no matter what you think of the encounter in the street, the facts say that 2 minutes after encountering Darren Wilson, Michael Brown was dead in the street. 2 minutes, shot 7 times from a distance of 148 feet in the middle of a residential area on a Saturday afternoon. If the officer's intent was to secure the safety of Michael and his friend as pedestrians, to indeed stop them from being in the middle of the street and obstructing traffic, I believe we can all agree that this was an epic fail. But what the events of that day did do was ignite a flame of rage and resistance that was further stoked by the fact that Michael's bullet-riddled body was left exposed and laying in that same street for over 4.5 hours without any attempt at medical intervention and absent any compassion for his mother and father, who were standing on the other side of some yellow tape. How do I know this? I don't know it from mainstream media. I know it because being in my home and others being in their grocery store, the story started to unravel on live stream. Both Ferguson and St. Louis were changed that day. And in the following days, the relatively small area of a municipality of 21,000 people held unrest that became larger than life as the entire region became redefined as Ferguson. The attention of the world, largely guided by mainstream media, would focus on the 3 days out of 387 of unrest. 3 days out of 387. There is no history of a longer protest by Black Americans in the United States for liberation other than the Montgomery bus boycott. And 3 of those days, there was unrest that resulted in property damage and the militarization of residential neighborhoods. The story was told without much attention given to the context. The story was and continues to be told from the vantage point of the hunter. The story lacks a contextual understanding of the history of racial segregation, economic inequality, and overbearing law enforcement that produced so much of the tension now evident on the streets of Ferguson and in other large municipalities as well. St. Louis has long been one of the nation's most segregated metropolitan areas, 4th most racially polarized city in the nation, and there remains a high wall between Black residents, who overwhelmingly have lower incomes, and the white power structure that dominates city councils and police departments like the one in Ferguson. Ferguson's complex social and racial history date to the 19th century, when the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County went their separate ways, leading to the formation of dozens of small communities outside of the city. St. Louis County is comprised of 91 separate municipalities. 91, each having its own governance system, and 82 of them have their own police departments. In the 20th century, St. Louis became a stopping point for the northern migration of Southern blacks seeking factory jobs in Detroit and Chicago. As blacks moved into the city and whites moved out, real estate agents and city leaders, in a pattern familiar elsewhere in this country, conspired to keep blacks out of the suburbs through the use of zoning ordinances and restrictive covenants. By the 70s, many blacks started leaving the city of St. Louis as well, and black families were attracted to older inner ring suburbs like Ferguson in the northern part of the county, because they were built before restrictive zoning tactics and therefore allowed for apartments. As black families moved into Ferguson, white families moved out. In 1980, the town was 85% white and 14% black. By 2010, it was 29% white and 69% black. Now Ferguson is like many of the suburbs around St. Louis, inner ring towns that accommodate white flight decades ago, but that are now largely black, and yet they retain white power structures. The mayor and the police chief were white. 5 of the 6 city council members were white. Until the last election, the media was gone, so let me give you some updates. The Ferguson police chief is now black. The mayor is still white. We can all live together. City council is now 50-50. It's a result of an increase in voter turnout that was fueled by what happened in Ferguson. The school boards consist of 6 white members and 1 Hispanic. No blacks were on the school boards until recently. This disparity was most evident in the police department, where only 3 of the 53 officers serving when Michael Brown were killed were black. The largely white force stopped black residents far out of proportion to their population. According to statistics kept by the state attorney general, blacks account for 86% of the traffic stops in the city and 93% of the arrests after those stops. At the time of Michael Brown's death, 16,000 people with active warrants in Ferguson, in a population of only 21,000. Similar problems exist around St. Louis County, where earlier this year, the state chapter of the NAACP filed a federal civil rights complaint alleging widespread racial profiling by police departments. This racialization and criminalization of communities cannot be divorced from the economic, educational, and recreational inequities that contribute to acts of both internalized and state-sanctioned violence. And yet, even in the midst of this, because of live stream and because of social media, while Ferguson was getting larger, the world was indeed getting smaller. As young people as far away as Palestine began tweeting young people in Ferguson with instructions on how to make homemade gas masks and how to avoid damaging effects of airborne chemicals that were deployed against protesters whose most powerful weapon was their bodies. These tweets became a lifeline, and Ferguson protesters grabbed it. Law enforcement's response to a sea of black bodies armed largely with their voices, as raucous and as profane as they sometimes were, was a militarized police force, armored trucks, and sniper posts, not in a war zone, but in a residential area of approximately 5 blocks. Ironically, it is not only Ferguson protesters who have a connection with what is happening in the Middle East, but law enforcement has an increasing connection with Israeli military. After 9/11, the U.S. began sending police chiefs to Israel to train in counterterrorism attacks. As these trips became more commonplace, the militarization of U.S. law enforcement also was driven by the creation of various homeland security initiatives and billions of dollars of surplus military-grade equipment donated to local police departments through the 1033 program after 9/11. Some of this weaponry, my friends, found its way to Ferguson, and the terrorists, young black bodies who refused to be denied their right to assemble, their right to nonviolent protest, and their right to be treated as citizens of the United States. There are many similarities of what it means to be lions in occupied territory. The stripping of humanity in all of its forms is indeed a violent act, and as people of faith, we are called to resist. What we face is not simply a social and a political construct, but I suggest to you this morning, at its core, what we are wrestling with is a theological construct. People are not born into politics. People are not born on law enforcement. People are not born with cameras in their hands. Well, maybe they are now. But many of us are born into our faith. As people of faith, we must take responsibility for our interpretive narrative of the scriptures that we hold sacred. We have treated our sacred text as if it is God's story of a holy people instead of a people's story of a holy God. This is significant and an important shift, and I believe it to be in line with what Scripture ultimately reveals about God. God's sole agenda is righteousness, and this agenda locates God always on the side of the oppressed. And in case you have not been paying attention, the oppressed changes over time. God's agenda is not nationalism. God is pro-justice, and God's agenda is the restoration of right relationship between God and all of God's people. But we have taken the story and we've moved beyond the universal truths of the narrative to particular preference of those who tell the story at any given time. How do we understand all of creation in a context of chosenness? I imagine if one listens to any group tell of their encounters with God, they will tell of the specialness of their relationship. This is one reason African American Christians cling so closely to the Exodus story. It is not our particular narrative of deliverance, but we recognize this God, and we claim the truth of this God who rescues as our own. That group of clergy that I mentioned to you earlier is interfaith. And I remember in one of our truth-telling sessions sitting across from someone who has become a very good friend of mine. Her name is Rabbi Rory. She's in St. Louis. And we were talking about the surprises that we find in one another's faith. And she recounted for me her first time visiting a Black Christian church and hearing the preacher preach the Exodus text and coming to the realization he thinks that's about him. This is indeed what telling the story will do to us. What I am suggesting is a reframing of a theological narrative that suggests a God who is equally concerned with all of creation. I am suggesting that all of humanity is chosen by God, and therefore it is antithetical to the gospel to presume God shares our disdain for the other. I'm suggesting that we have replaced a God of favor with our God of favoritism. What I am suggesting requires a willingness for us to deconstruct some of the messages that we have been guilty of sending, a willingness to wrestle with uncomfortable text. What then are we to do with a God who commands Joshua to take the land? I do not know. But I do know that this wrestling is not without precedent. I know that we found a way to wrestle Black bodies away from a biblical narrative that clearly affirms slavery. I know that we have found a way to wrestle women's bodies and voices away from a biblical narrative that would have us be silent in the church. I know that we have found a way to wrestle a patriotic narrative of capitalism out of the story of an Afro-Semitic Palestinian who was born on the wrong side of the tracks. We are experts at extrapolating stories that soothe us, but God has not called us to be comforted, but rather to comfort the afflicted. As people of faith, we must find a way to wrestle with our sacred texts until we can see God in the face of everyone. Ultimately, this is not a political question for me or a question of social construct. Ultimately, our world will not change because of policies. Our world will change because we are courageous enough to wrestle with this theological question. What are we to make of a God who has been portrayed as being divided against God's self? I am reminded once again during this political season of the danger of narratives that demonize the other. It is so tempting to become self-righteous. I spend a lot of time on social media, and I often have been convicted, have had to repent for my words in my self-righteousness of taking the humanity away from those I disagree with. It is so tempting and so easy to claim the high road in the name of justice, but do to others the very things that have been done to us. So easy for me to call in this political season the candidate that I do not support names that remove humanity. But when we do that, when we use our power and our connections and our storytelling to do to others what we claim to be against being done to us, then we are no better and we are no more righteous. It is too easy to look outside of ourselves for the answers that lie within. I began by telling you that the West African proverb says, until the lion tells the story, the hunter is always the hero. Let me end with a caution. Within us all lies both the lion and the hunter. We, those who have been called to be the storytellers, whether that's as a minister from a pulpit or as a part of media with your cameras and with your access to public communication, or whether that's a movement maker with access to an iPhone, and underground channels, it is important that we remember that until the lions of this day are heard, the story really has not been told. What say you, my friends? Shall we be the storytellers who place context with text so that all can be understood? Or will we relish in the glory of the hunter while the lion continues to be villainized? Thank you.